Welcome to Below the Line, where we talk about working in Hollywood from the crew perspective. My name is Skid. I'm a former assistant director and your host. Today, we're talking about Judas and the Black Messiah, the 2021 film starring Lakeith Stanfield and Daniel Kaluuya. At Rotten Tomatoes, the tomato meter score is 96%, and the critics' consensus reads, an electrifying dramatization of historical events, Judas and the Black Messiah is a forceful condemnation of racial injustice and a major triumph for its director and stars. Let me introduce my guests. Sam Lysenko, you were the production designer on the film. Welcome back to Below the Line.
Great to be here. Thank you.
And joining us as well for the first time is Jeremy Woolsey. Jeremy, you were the art director. Glad you could join us.
Great. Thanks for having me.
Now, as a reminder to listeners, Below the Line is now on IMDb, the Internet Movie Database, so it's easy to cross-reference the credits of my guests. Before we dive into the specifics of this project, talk to me a little bit about your roles. What is the relationship between the art director and the production designer?
The understanding of creative problem solving is comparable between the two positions, but I think one is, in the case of the production designer, an attempt to distill aesthetic information both from the source material and from the crew feedback, and to facilitate communication between the art department and the other departments and the director in service of the script. Whereas the art directional role, and I'm sure Jeremy could speak to this with more specificity, is one of an understanding of best practices for execution of those creative concepts. So I think between the two, you have a holistic approach towards aesthetic problem solving, but I think that it's a different sort of brain wiring in terms of how best to move that discussion forward.
And a bit of that execution Sam was referring to certainly involves money, schedule, time, interface with every single department, and really taking everything that Sam and brings to me and brings to our department and executing it, and literally executing it through the process. And it's a great challenge. Every film is different, and especially when you're working with someone for the first time. 44 days.
Yeah, it's like 44 days. And it got progressively colder as we were getting to the finish line. I remember our last day of photography, I think it was 12 degrees while the sun was up. And then that was a night shoot for the shooting company on frozen ground outside. And it must have dropped below 5 or 10 degrees below zero that night. It was getting very bitter very quickly. But it was kind of that last push we all wanted to get through.
And to be fair, we opened set up for about 4 minutes and then left.
Yeah. We were riding high in our warm.
We were hugging and saying goodbye, and we were out of there. It was too much for me, especially being from New Orleans, and I had never really been in that kind of, and I wasn't dressed properly. The whole last night was a mess on my end. But we said goodbye, and we left them to it. And that was it.
There was no particular need for either of you to be there over the course of filming last night.
It was the big refinery shootout sequence. And we had been problem solving that location from early September, right? We found that location fairly early on, and we knew that there were considerations to be made to be able to shoot that sequence 360. And we had done, I think, more critical run-throughs of that location with cinematography and special effects and stunts than I have ever encountered on a location-based shoot. I think we did probably somewhere in the range of 8 to 10 full walkthrough scouts of that location with the full company, just to make sure that everything was in order. And part of that was, serious conversations about it's going to be fucking cold by the time we get here. So let's figure all this shit out now. I think that was a driving factor. So I think we were kind of over-prepared for that last sequence by the time it came up in photography.
What other sequences or locations on this shoot provided memorable challenges for you guys?
I was blown away, and I'm going to give credit where it's due. This was really Jeremy's baby. But the after the police set fire to Black Panther headquarters, the entirety of the process of rebuilding was cheated in a building of comparable architecture on a higher floor, no less, with a little CG help, down the street from our hero location. And I was very worried about how to accurately portray that space. And Jeremy and our assistant art director, Geza, the local animal from Cleveland, The two of them really, really just blew me away with that cheat. There is no way, even as an educated viewer, that I watch that sequence and don't emotionally connect that burnt out hull of an interior space with the space we saw previously in the movie. That I think the cheat is seamless, other than the fact that the ceilings are a little lower. That worked out quite well. That was a very memorable location for me. And Claire's scenic work. Oh my gosh, the entire scenic department. It's a very convincing interior. That could have easily gone south real quick.
Yep, agreed. We also had a lot of fun scouting several, interesting locations to sort of navigate having access to and what we could do in there. But we found our location manager, maybe Sam, I wasn't a part of finding it, but this great bar that was from the opening scene, fantastic place. That was a challenge to kind of turn that facade into something. The interior was absolutely wonderful. But that was fun to meet just the characters. It was a bit of Sam, was it a speakeasy, or I can't remember what
so there was this incredible, the interior of that bar was pretty much turnkey, and the exterior facade of the building had been clad in vinyl siding, presumably in the 80s, and the ground level was fat painted with colors that felt a little too contemporary. There was nothing about it. And at some point they had repaved within the last 10 years. So there was nothing about it on the exterior at ground level that really sung as a period bar. And it was the opening of the film. So I was really worried about it. But across the street was a glazed tile exterior bar that would have been perfect if the interior hadn't been gutted. It was an abandoned space. And that was our first exterior location. We got construction and scenic started working on that first. So we just said, Can we make this thing look like the building across the street from it? And it was on our drive from the office to the shop. So on a daily basis, we could just see, crew members just buzzing along, slowly putting up all the cladding and getting that thing ready. And that was our first day of photography. It was our first exterior location. And it was kind of the first major attempt at a move for the art department, in addition to being the first scene of the movie. And it worked out quite well. I think the neon sign was a figment that was pure fabrication. And then we tried to maintain as much of that interior as we could and just kind of thinned it out to remove any anachronistic dressing that wasn't working for us. Yeah. And I remember that first day we were trying to problem solve the crosswalks because we didn't have city control over the walk don't walk signs, which had been converted to LED iconography instead of the sentence case lettering. And so we had come up with these incredible inlays that we would just illegally pop the covers off and slap them up right before we shot, that were like milky opaque, so that as it was blinking, it worked for us.
It worked. Yeah.
As long as it said don't walk, it was working. That was the first push. That was our first push, that location.
And how much prep time was there going to be? We talk about driving by every day to see this come together. How much prep time did you guys have in Cleveland before filming got underway?
I think hammers were probably swinging for about 3 weeks, I want to say, but we were pretty loaded in terms of exterior pieces happening in rapid succession, because we had that bar, we had our hero exterior Black Panther block, including the headquarters and some critical adaptations that needed to occur on the interior of that. And we also had this kind of looming this tracking shot with a 360 pan as the car made a U-turn on a wholly other street. And they were all happening within the first 2.5 weeks of photography. And so we were really pushing the construction crew time-wise. I think it was a little tight, but all of those things were happening almost simultaneously. So there was always, at any point, a standing crew kind of swinging hammers, I think probably starting 3 weeks out and then running all the way until I think the second week of photography, our core started to move into our ramshackle in stage space to start building Fred Hampton's interior apartment. I think I got that timing right. It was something like that.
Yeah. Overall, I don't recall more than 8 weeks of prep. and then maybe 10. I don't recall exactly, but we jumped in there and we were generating drawings within a week and a half to at least to review and get some prelims out and start really hatching a plan with the AD department. But the ramshackle stage certainly was a challenge because it wasn't a stage. It was a warehouse with limited clearance, not a lot of room around the set. I mean, we were hugging whatever imaginary fire lane there was, but it was basically recreating the Fred Hampton apartment. And it was a very interesting and fulfilling challenge to go through all the files and really try to understand and get that footprint to scale of what it really was, with a few little tweaks for camera. But so a lot of the research we pulled was from the court case, and I believe from the O'Neill sketch. That kind of sort of helped us initially until we were able to dig further and find more technical documents that really gave us the footprint of the apartment. So we started with that, with a 3D model almost straight away. I think that was the first thing that we had a remote set designer work on while we dealt with some location work. But we wanted to get that, sort of sorted out, because that was our truly biggest stage build. And that was obviously a very important set.
Yeah. And between, we had sort of ramped construction up over the course of photography. So I think when they first started and had just finished, setting up shop, they were doing Chicago themed police barricades for crowd control and exterior police station signage. And then by the time we got into the apartment, they were such a well-oiled machine that between their efforts, construction and scenic and set deck, other than the front-facing facade wall, in the film, it's bay windows to match our exterior location. But I think in the actual apartment, it was just on a flat plane. Other than that one wall, it's darn near an exact replica of what the apartment looked like the night he was shot down in the sticks of furniture. I mean, set deck in particular, Becky really nailed every single piece. She recreated the mattress and bedspread, tracked down duplicates of the same chairs that were in evidence in the crime scene photographs. The bullet holes that construction laid in with special effects to squib are generally, for the most part, in the exact locations that bullet holes appeared in the evidence photos. So I think, in terms of a level of specificity and execution, like you cannot get much closer to accurately portraying history than how efficient they were in recreating that interior apartment space.
Now, this goal to recreate and be accurate, obviously that can be very expensive. And there's a good portion of the audience that isn't going to recognize that. What was really driving it on this film? Both of you have mentioned it multiple times. And so I wonder, is that coming from Shaka King's vision from the beginning, or is that something that collaboratively just everyone decided this was the best way to tell the story?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably more born out of the understanding we were making a Warner Brothers action movie that would be enjoyable to watch. And I think that the level of sensitivity towards the true events and the fact that we knew we were making something digestible out of it kind of became a sort of guiding factor in our understanding that the social responsibility to do the story justice trumped all. I don't know if we ever verbalized it as a team, but I definitely think that there was a sense in the office that we can have fun doing this as long as we're doing these people justice historically. And the story itself is so heartbreaking and so underappreciated in the course of American history that I think to do anything less would have been a disservice to what actually occurred. And I think everybody felt that way too. I don't think that there was ever a need to verbalize it. All of the kind of the positive press around the execution and appreciation for the film theatrically, even down to the fact that it's the first film to be nominated with all Black producers, let alone the first major film to ever be made with all Black producers. These were not daily conversations on set. I think the daily conversations were more, how do we do this story justice and how do we make an entertaining film?
Not to mention we had the Hampton family on site.
Yeah, that's very true. When Mama Akua, Fred's widow, is there, you're damned not to try your best to make it feel right and real for her. And, you know, in some capacity, as much as it seems that this is a battle waged in history, there are not just living remnants, but there are people still fighting this every day. And so who am I, some hipster kid from New York, to decide the aesthetic value set of the struggles that they live through? I think by assuming a level of social responsibility to be as accurate as possible, it foregoes the inevitability of having to have conversations about whether or not you're doing it justice. You are doing it justice, and therefore the conversation becomes, how can we also make this a good movie simultaneously?
Sam, you've been on the show before to review our Oscar nominees, just sort of in general terms of production design and sort of the eye you bring to it. I think last year you were just getting ready to go start this film. And I was surprised this year, given how well the movie's reviewed and the other categories where it was nominated, including cinematography and Best Picture, that it didn't also earn a nod for production design. Not to bring up a sore spot, but
you son of
that
a
must
bitch.
sting a little bit. This film's so much effort into it. It surprises me that it didn't make the short list.
Yeah, well, thank you for saying that. I think I'm of two opinions. The first is that I think it was underappreciated by the time voting had commenced for the Art Directors Guild Awards, and that probably prohibited allocation of certain funds for publicity for an Academy Awards push on the business side of things. That may have hurt our chances towards a design nomination. But more importantly, I think as a credit to everyone who worked with me in the art department in particular, but also to my fucking self, because I did a great job. I think it's important to remember that oftentimes a movie gets nominated for production design because people are noticing the design. And I think that if our main tenet, our modus operandi in terms of approach was to do service and justice to a historical level of accuracy, when you compound that with the fact that it got nominated for Best Picture and Best Cinematography, what that tells me is it's a great looking movie that people love to watch, and they weren't thinking about design. And so I think that if that's the case, then the design was efficient and didn't do a disservice to the story by being noticeable, even though it takes place in 1969. So if you can get lost in the fiction of the film and enjoy it for what it is, enough so much that it gets nominated for Best Picture, then I see that as a bigger win than necessarily getting an individual design nomination. And I'm only saying that because I wasn't nominated. But I think I'm incredibly contented with the reaction of the movie, and you know, it's fine. It's fine that it didn't happen.
Well, I've appreciated you guys coming on and giving us some more details about all the work that went into making this as accurate and enjoyable film as it is. Thank both you guys for taking time and joining us here on the show.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks.
Great. Thank you.
Listeners, I hope you're enjoying the current season. Your feedback is always welcome. You can send email comments to skid, S-K-I-D, at belowtheline.biz. That's B-I-Z. Every episode of the podcast is now on IMDb. So if you'd like to learn more about my guests, you can easily cross-reference their podcast appearances and film credits. Please rate us wherever you get your podcasts. It helps us reach new listeners. If you're on Facebook, you can find photos and other behind-the-scenes materials at Podcast Below the Line. And finally, you can follow the podcast on Twitter and Instagram. It's at Pod Below the Line. Thanks to Curtis Five for our music and John Wan for our logo. The logo is available on t-shirts, mugs, and stickers at redbubble.com. As always, I appreciate you listening. Be safe out there. I think, Jeremy, I'm catching your mic here. So if you can try and, I don't know, position the phone out so there's a little more drag away from your clothes, that might be something to watch for.
Okay. Is that better?
I think so.
Okay.
That'd be good. And we'll
just lose the shirt.